Hi, I just spoke to one of the other officers there. My name is Dennis Fagan. I'm a retired detective in New York City. I run the security for World Wrestling, and one of our wrestlers that lives down there is missing. And he told me just to say we need a welfare check done.
And what's his name?
Chris Benoit. It's spelled B-E-N-O-I-T.
Okay, and he's a wrestler?
Yes, what happened, he's a very religious gentleman, and yesterday he was supposed to show up at a pay-per-view and never got on the plane, never showed up. They've tried to reach his wife, Nancy. She doesn't answer. They tried to call his house. It's out of character for him. So at 3 o'clock this morning, there was a message left for one of the other wrestlers, and basically it says, the dogs are in the backyard, the back door is open, goodbye. And that was it.
Dogs in the yard?
Yes, and the back door is open. He didn't say anything else, and that was it.
Door.
That message was left at 3 o'clock this morning for another wrestler.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're watching this. If you haven't been here before, then welcome to the channel, and if you have been here before, then welcome back. Today we will be talking about Chris Benoit, a professional wrestler that some people say was the best ever in wrestling. There is a lot that Chris did in his career. His career actually spanned 22 years, so apologies if I miss anything out, but there was a lot to cover for this case. Today we look at how this professional wrestler became a murderer. Christopher Michael Benoit was born on the 21st of May 1967 in Montreal, Canada. His parents were Michael and Margaret Benoit, and he had a sister called Laurie. When he was young, he was said to be really quiet and really soft-spoken, but one thing that he did often talk about was wrestling. When he was young, he started watching Stampede Pro Wrestling, and from the age of 12, he knew that this was exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He knew he wanted to be a pro wrestler just like the ones that he'd seen in Stampede, and he would spend all of his spare time just working out how to wrestle and become a professional wrestler. He would spend a lot of time in Alberta to watch the wrestling, and he would start bodybuilding too. And in bodybuilding, he would go on to win numerous awards for this sport. When Chris watched Stampede, he actually had a favourite wrestler, and his name was the Dynamite Kid. Chris was really inspired by the Dynamite Kid, and so he knew that the Dynamite Kid had big arms, so Chris wanted to get big arms just like him. He was also highly inspired by Bret Hart. So much so that Chris, when he was wrestling professionally, would actually use Bret Hart's signature move, the sharpshooter, as one of his finishing moves. The sharpshooter is essentially a move where the winning wrestler will sit on the back, like bum bit, of the other wrestler and pull the leg backwards, thus creating a lot of damage and winning the fight. Chris didn't really have a social life outside of the world of wrestling because even from a very young age, all he wanted to do was wrestle. And this truly became everything to him, so unless he was wrestling, unless he was speaking to other people about wrestling, he didn't really have a social life beyond this. In Alberta, Stampede Wrestling was hosted. The founder of Stampede was a man called Stu Hart. Stu Hart is the father of Bret and Owen Hart, who are also major professional wrestlers. Stu saw great potential in Chris, and actually later on in interviews, Chris would then say that he owed everything to Stu Hart. On the weekends, Chris would go and travel up to Alberta to train with the Hart family, and they all became incredibly close. When Chris was 18, he made his debut in the ring. He began wrestling professionally in Stampede Wrestling, and he participated in a tag team match and ended up winning after pinning one of his opponents with a move called the Sunset Flip. In 1988, Chris would marry his girlfriend Martina. There's not too much to mention about Martina, but the couple were together for 9 years and had 2 children. They had David, who was born in 1993, and they had Megan, who was born in 1997. Martina and Chris would divorce in 1997. So going back to Chris's career, and Chris is working in Stampede and he's actually getting quite a name for himself. He's gaining popularity and he is being recognised as an excellent wrestler. He was starting to be seen by bigger leagues, and in 1989 he would move to Japan to go and work for New Japan Pro Wrestling. In Japan he took the name the Pegasus Kid, and he had a gimmick of wearing a mask. But he didn't stop at Japan, he also gained credibility in Mexico and Europe too. He won multiple championship titles across the world too, and throughout the early 90s he won the Best of Super Juniors 2 times and also won the Super J Cup tournament. In 1992, Chris would then go and work with the WCW, the World Championship Wrestling, and in his time here he would again be noticed for being such a fantastic wrestler. It was in 1994 in the ECW, the Extreme Championship Wrestling, that he gained the nickname Crippler Benoit, as he would accidentally break fellow wrestler Sabu's neck within seconds of their match. He won his first American title in 1995, winning the ECW World Tag Team Championship. Benoit was still in contract with Japan, so he would consistently work between WCW and NJPW. At the WCW in 1998, Benoit entered into a long-term feud with Booker T. The wrestlers fought it out several times for many months. In 1999, Benoit teamed up with Dean Malenko to win the WCW Tag Team Championship and formed a group named the Horsemen, which was later renamed the Revolution. However, he remained unhappy with the management at WCW. After a title win for which he wasn't officially credited, Benoit made up his mind to leave the WCW and signed up with the World Wrestling Federation, the WWF. This was a program that ran for 11 seasons. Before we go further into Chris's career, we need to talk about Nancy Sullivan. Nancy Elizabeth Toffoloni was born on the 17th of May 1964 in Boston, Massachusetts. Nancy had a good childhood and a good education. She graduated high school and started modelling whilst also working answering phones for an insurance company. I'm not really sure how to say this. I don't know if it's Douse or Dorse, so please excuse my pronunciation of this. But in 1982, Nancy would marry businessman Jim Douse. In 1984, she received a job offer for being on the cover of the magazine Wrestling All-Stars. From this, she would then work at the Orlando wrestling shows selling programs. She appeared as Para in the old apartment wrestling features, and it was on this particular shoot that she would meet Kevin Sullivan. The two would click, and Kevin thought that Nancy would be a perfect addition to his wrestling entourage, and after months of convincing, Nancy became an on-air valet, taking the name Fallen Angel. I didn't know what a valet meant in wrestling, so I googled it, and basically it's a very pretty woman who will walk alongside the wrestler to make the wrestler look good, and this was Nancy's part when it came to her and Kevin. She made her in-ring debut on the 7th of July 1984 in Florida, and from here she would become a key member of Sullivan's wrestling group. The pair would travel throughout the USA with their heavy face paint and overall gimmick and start to receive attention. In 1985, Nancy and Kevin would get married in the same year that Nancy would divorce from Jim Douse. And I don't know why Nancy and Jim got divorced, so I do apologise for not having that information. I'm going to take a guess that because Nancy was travelling all the time because she was now in the wrestling circuit, that their marriage just wasn't as tight as it once was. But I don't know exactly why they did decide to divorce, so apologies for this. She would go under the name of Fallen Angel in appearances up until 1987, but she would also find new fame and a new name in the WCW in 1989. Nancy would make her first appearance in the WCW under the guise of Robin Green. Robin Green was a geeky fan who was obsessed with Rick Steiner. She would sit in the front row, and every time Rick fought, she would interact with him. This story continued for a little while until Robin Green then turned on Steiner and formed an alliance with Kevin Sullivan. From here on, she would be known as Woman, and she became the manager of several other wrestlers in the WCW. Nancy and Kevin's relationship wasn't ideal, and it was found later that Nancy kept records of her abuse from Kevin. One detailed entry mentions a time in which Nancy got a black eye from Kevin. Kevin refutes the allegations and said that Nancy actually stabbed him in an argument. Kevin said that Nancy actually spent 3 days in jail for this, and Kevin had to bail her out. He then mentions that once he bailed her out, he didn't go back to live with her because he just thought that this moment was the end of their marriage. He absolutely did not see a future with her after this. Nancy would move to the ECW, but she would eventually return to the WCW, where a new storyline would be produced in which she would have an affair with fellow wrestler Chris Benoit. It was to produce a feud between Chris Benoit's character and Kevin Sullivan's character. This sparked a gripping storyline for the viewers, but was not expected that the affair would actually progress into real life too. Nancy and Chris would spend a lot of time together for the sake of their work, and Chris did not want his wife Martina to become paranoid, and he tried to reassure her, but attraction took hold of Chris and they began to develop feelings for one another. Because of this, in 1997, Nancy and Kevin would divorce, and Chris and Martina would also divorce. In the same year, Nancy and Chris would get engaged. Nancy would leave wrestling altogether in the same year, and Kevin Sullivan fought his last match, which was his retirement match, and he ended up losing the fight to Chris Benoit. They said that this particular match looked more realistic than normal matches do, and honestly, it probably did because of what was happening outside of the ring. Nancy would begin to manage Chris's career from home, and on the 23rd of November 2000, she and Chris would get married. It is said that their marriage was quite rocky from the start. They absolutely loved each other, but things could get tense in their relationship. In the year 2000, Chris's career was going from strength to strength. Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Perry Saturn and Dean Malenko formed the group The Radicals and debuted in the WWF. In a triple threat match against Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle, Benoit scored his first title victory, the Intercontinental Championship at WrestleMania in 2000. This started a long-term rivalry with Chris Jericho over the championship title. Chris would be scheduled to fight The Rock at the fully loaded WWF Championship, and he began to make a lot of money. In the same year, Chris and Nancy would welcome their baby boy Daniel into the world. Daniel was born on the 25th of February 2000. In January 2001, Chris Benoit ended up losing his title to Chris Jericho. After ending his association with the Radicals in early 2001, Benoit started a feud with Kurt Angle and stole his Olympic gold medal. The rivalry lasted for days and included several fights and tag team matches. In 2001, Benoit also required neck surgery due to an injury that happened in one of his matches. In 2002, the first WWE draft moved him to SmackDown. In 2003, it is said that Nancy filed for divorce from Chris. She cited that the marriage was irrevocably broken and she alleged cruel treatment from Chris. She dropped the suit in August 2003 and a restraining order that she had on her husband. Despite Benoit's ongoing feud with Kurt Angle, the story moved to Benoit and Kurt Angle being partnered up, and they became the WWE Tag Team Champions. He was given an opportunity to fight for the World Heavyweight title at WrestleMania 20 after he won the Royal Rumble in 2004. He won the World Heavyweight Championship by defeating Triple H in the title match. This night was particularly iconic as on the same night Eddie Guerrero won the title match against Kurt Angle. Eddie and Chris had been working the same circuits for years, and this moment meant so much to the both of them as it truly showed how far they had come as wrestlers. They had achieved their dreams together, and the best friends walked off this night as world champions. Chris Benoit became the WWE United States Champion after beating Booker T in a title match. He returned to the ECW in 2007. In the ECW, he earned a title match for the ECW World Heavyweight Championship, but he backed out due to a family emergency. And in the same year, 2007, things took the worst turn. The family of the WWE noted Chris as a doting husband and father. They said that he was one of the kindest people you could meet, and everyone loved and respected him in that organisation. No one expected what was to come. So on Saturday, the 23rd of June 2007, 3 wrestlers are meant to be meeting in Texas to do the Texas Loop. Scott Armstrong, Chavo Guerrero, and Chris Benoit are meant to be meeting each other. So Chavo then gets a phone call from Chris, and Chris then says, "I won't be able to make it to Texas tonight because Nancy and Daniel have food poisoning." Chris then says, "I don't want to leave them because I want to be there for them, I want to make sure they're okay." And Chavo says, "Okay, that's fine, we'll see you tomorrow at the pay-per-view in Houston." And Chris is like, yeah, I'll be there, yeah. Chris then says to Chavo, "I love you." And Chavo says, "I love you too, man." And he finds this quite weird. He feels that something is wrong. So he asks Chris, he says, "Are you okay?" And Chris then replies, "Yeah, I'm okay, I'm just really tired." So Chavo then ends the phone call by saying, "Okay, well, any problems, please call me." The next day, Chavo is making his way to the airport, and at 5:30 a.m. he receives a text from Chris. The text reads, "The dogs are in the enclosed pool area and the back door is open." Chavo is of course incredibly confused, and 30 seconds later he receives the exact same text off of Nancy's phone. The dogs are in the enclosed pool area and the back door is open. So Chavo is thinking that's really weird, and then straight after these text messages he gets another text from Chris with Chris's address. Chavo then meets Scott at the airport and he says, "Did you get any weird messages from Chris this morning?" And Scott's like, "Yeah, this one." And it is the exact same text. So Scott and Chavo turn up at Houston as planned, and Chris is not there. Everyone is now worried because Chris is never late. Vince McMahon then sends a welfare check to Chris's house. The police then go to do a welfare check at Chris's house and they don't know how to get in, but there is a neighbour and she seems incredibly helpful, and they notice the dogs that are running around and they ask her if she could put the dogs away so they can go and do a welfare check on the house. And she immediately replies, "Yep, no problem, I actually look after the dogs when the family goes away, so let me go and do that." She then goes off to take the dogs in and put them away just so the police can get to doing their welfare check, and she's taking a long time. Well, a longer time than what the police expect is usual. So the police are now concerned, and that is when the neighbour runs out screaming, "Daniel is dead, Daniel is dead." So shortly after this, it is found that all 3 members of the Benoit family have died. They are in 3 separate rooms, and Nancy and Daniel have both been strangled, and Chris has unalived himself. Nancy's hands and feet were tied up, and she was wrapped in a blanket with a Bible left next to her. Daniel was found in his bedroom, and it was later found that he had been sedated before he too was strangled. There was a knife that was found under Daniel's bed. Daniel also had a Bible placed next to him. Back in Houston, no one knows what is happening except Vince McMahon. Vince sits all of his wrestlers in front of the ring, and this is very unusual, so all of the wrestlers know that something horrific has happened. Vince McMahon then stands in the ring, so he's got a good view over his wrestlers and they can all see him, and he says that he has just had the news that Chris Benoit, Nancy and Daniel have all passed away. Everyone was understandably in shock, and Vicky Guerrero just starts screaming. She's completely in shock, and this was just her body's reaction just to scream. So as you can imagine, there's just an awful atmosphere in there. Chavo then takes Vince to one side and he's like, "Please tell me what's happened." And Vince just hugs him because no one knows yet what has happened. They just know that Chris, Nancy and Daniel are dead. Chavo cannot believe it, and he's purely in disbelief to Vince, and he's asking for more information, but again, Vince just holds him tight and they just kind of have this moment together. The WWE that night were meant to have a normal pay-per-view showing, but once they found out about Chris Benoit and his family, they decided to do a tribute show that lasted 3 hours to Chris's memory.
WWE superstar Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel are dead.
However, once they found out that Chris had actually murdered his family and then unalived himself, they very quickly removed this tribute show. It is said that when Chavo received the phone call from Chris, Nancy and Daniel had both been murdered. Nancy was killed on the Friday and Daniel was killed in his bed on Saturday morning. Chris Benoit would then unalive himself on Sunday. It was also later found that Chris had actually looked up the best and most efficient way to break a neck, and that is how he took his own life. Many wrestlers have spoken about this since, and Chris Jericho even said that he couldn't believe this at all. Chris was an incredible person, and if I had to leave my kids with someone on the weekend, I would have no problem with leaving them with Chris. There has been a lot of theories around why Chris murdered his wife and son, but there has never been a true answer for why this happened. There has been a lot of theories of demon possession, a fit of rage, but the most believed one would be head trauma. Because Chris encountered a lot of head injuries in wrestling, especially with one of his signature moves being a diving headbutt, this was believed to have caused Chris significant brain injury and caused him to lose who he really was and be able to murder his family. My theory? Chris had brain damage, sure. His autopsy proved that he had the brain of an 88-year-old Alzheimer's patient. But also in 2005, Eddie Guerrero would die of a heart attack. And I truly think this broke Chris. They were best friends for years and they had been through so much together and done the whole circuit together pretty much all of their lives. They were like brothers. I don't think that Chris knew how to mourn Eddie, and with the brain damage, this just sent his brain into overload. There is absolutely no excuse for what Chris did. The murder was also premeditated because, as I say, he had looked up how to break a neck. He had already killed Nancy and Daniel before the phone call, so he knew what he was about to do next. He could have absolutely reached out to anyone just about how he was feeling. He could have also killed Nancy and then just not attacked Daniel, just left, just gone. Just got the WWE to send a welfare check to go and get Daniel, and then Daniel could go into care. He could have done anything, but he didn't. He decided to commit the murders and then unalive himself. So his actions are completely inexcusable, but I do think that the death of Eddie Guerrero was the turning point for his mental health. Chris Benoit is consistently referred to as a family man, that he was all about the health and well-being of his family, and because of this case is still one of the most shocking cases of WWE history. Since the murder, WWE has deleted a lot of Chris's moments, and his name is banned from the WWE in its entirety. Nancy was just 40 years old when she died, and Daniel was just 7. Chris's son David opened up in an interview in 2020 and says that the man who acted that way that night was not his father. The doctor had also said that Chris had CTE and made him act completely out of character. David also says that Chris was offered a backstage promotional deal in 2006 so that he could recover from his injuries over the years, but that he would still remain a massive part of the WWE, but Chris declined. David still wishes that his father had accepted the deal all those years ago. The WWE immediately changed their wellness policy after the death, recognising the damage that drugs could have to their wrestlers. Chris Benoit's body contained 10 times the normal level of steroid testosterone despite passing a WWE steroid test 3 months earlier, forcing the company to seriously change their drug policy and eradicate steroids from their company. They also banned chair shots to the head, a well overdue change to protect their wrestlers. So that is the case of Chris Benoit. I'm sorry it took me so long to film this and get this out. It has been a really tough week. I've just been really emotional, and doing this video today, there's been moments that I've just had to pause and be like, compose yourself. Like every time I read about Daniel, I just get a bit emotional. This one was hard going, as a lot of them are. None of them are nice stories. But this one was requested, so I hope I did justice on the Chris Benoit story and the life of Nancy and Daniel. My thoughts are with Martina, David and Megan, because I don't know how they have coped with this. Martina, of course, loved Chris. David and Megan were his children, so I just hope that they are now doing well. It is a truly shocking case, and obviously there's no answers for why this actually happened. But I am glad that on the back of this, the WWE have put measures in place to hopefully ensure that nothing like this happens ever again. If you enjoy this type of content, do feel free to subscribe to the channel. We upload a new video every 2 weeks. If it's not every 2 weeks, it is absolutely every month. We have got a lot more cases in the pipeline. I am literally writing through my next 4, and I hope to get those out to you very soon. Thank you for watching, thank you for being here. I hope you have a wonderful week ahead, but for now, that's all from me. Thanks again, and bye-bye.